Do you ever wonder why your adult children treat you like a stranger? You raised them, sacrificed for them, worked countless hours to provide everything they needed, yet now they see you as nothing more than an obligation on their calendar. Perhaps you've noticed how they arrive late to family gatherings, spend more time on their phones than talking to you, and leave as quickly as politeness allows. The painful truth is that good intentions during their childhood don't automatically translate into respect and connection in their adulthood. After decades of focusing on being a provider, you may have forgotten how to be a person they actually want to spend time with. The retirement years that should bring family closer together often reveal just how far apart you've grown. The reality hits hardest when you finally have time to build the relationships you always promised yourself you'd nurture later. You reach out with enthusiasm, only to discover your children view your newfound availability as neediness rather than opportunity. They've built lives that function perfectly well without your daily involvement, and your attempts to claim a central role feel intrusive to them. What you intended as love, they experience as pressure, and what you see as your rightful place in their lives, they see as outdated expectations. This isn't necessarily anyone's fault, but it is a problem that requires your understanding and action to solve. The patterns established over decades don't change simply because you're ready for them to change. Many parents in their 60s and beyond find themselves caught in this painful paradox. You have more wisdom than ever before, gained through years of experience and hard-won lessons, yet your children seem least interested in hearing it. They politely deflect your advice, change subjects when you try to share insights, and make major life decisions without consulting you. The respect you assumed would naturally accompany your role as their parent has somehow evaporated, replaced by a relationship that feels more like distant relatives than close family. You might find yourself wondering where things went wrong, replaying conversations and searching for the moment everything shifted. The truth is, this distance often builds gradually over years of well-meaning but misguided interactions. The good news is that these relationships can be rebuilt, but not through the strategies that worked when your children were young. Demanding respect because you're their parent will only push them further away, as will guilt trips about sacrifices you made or lectures about gratitude they should feel. Adult children operate by different rules than the ones you used when they lived under your roof, and learning these new rules is essential for reconnection. The path forward requires you to examine your own behavior honestly, adapt your communication style to match their adult needs, and prove your value in their current lives rather than relying on past contributions. This isn't about diminishing your worth as a parent, but about evolving into someone they choose to include rather than feel obligated to tolerate. What you're about to discover can transform even the most strained family relationships, regardless of how long the distance has existed. The strategies I'll share aren't theoretical concepts, but practical habits that have worked for countless parents who thought their relationships with their children were beyond repair. You'll learn how to shift from being someone your children endure to someone they genuinely value and seek out for guidance. These aren't quick fixes that promise overnight changes, but sustainable approaches that build trust and respect over time. If you're ready to take responsibility for your part in the distance and commit to consistent change, the relationships you thought were lost can be rebuilt stronger than before. To help you see this more clearly, I want to tell you a story about a man who discovered these truths the hard way. Robert had spent 40 years as a factory supervisor, managing schedules and meeting deadlines while his family grew up around him. At 67, newly retired with time on his hands, he found himself desperately wanting relationships with his 2 adult children, but they treated him like a relic from their past. His daughter Linda, 42 and climbing the corporate ladder, viewed family dinners as obligations to endure, arriving late and leaving as soon as socially acceptable. His son Michael, 39, and living 2 hours away in a small farming community, had perfected the art of polite avoidance with brief holiday calls and declined invitations. Robert's breaking point came on what should have been a celebration. Both children skipped his retirement party, offering work conflicts as excuses, but making no effort to reschedule or acknowledge the milestone in any meaningful way. Sitting alone in the community center, where a handful of former colleagues had gathered to wish him well, Robert felt utterly rejected and invisible to the people who mattered most. The following week, feeling lost and desperate for answers, he noticed a flyer for a seniors support group meeting in the same community center. Something about the phrase "rebuilding family connections" caught his attention, and despite never being one to seek help from strangers, he decided to attend. If you're finding value in this story and want to see how Robert transforms his relationships with practical strategies you can use today, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more wisdom on navigating life's challenges with dignity and purpose. That evening, Robert walked into a circle of folding chairs where 8 other people sat quietly nursing coffee from paper cups. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across faces that carried the weight of similar disappointments. The community center's beige walls were decorated with cheerful posters about senior activities, but the atmosphere in this particular room felt heavy with unspoken pain. The group leader, a 73-year-old man named Frank, with kind eyes and calloused hands, welcomed him with a warmth that immediately put him at ease. Frank's weathered face suggested years of outdoor work, but his gentle demeanor indicated someone who had learned patience through hard experience. As introductions went around the circle, Robert heard stories that mirrored his own frustration and pain with startling accuracy. There was Margaret, whose daughter lived 15 minutes away but visited only on major holidays, always rushing through conversations with one eye on her phone. James spoke about his son who had moved across the country immediately after college, graduation, and seemed to view phone calls home as burdensome, obligations rather than opportunities for connection. Sarah described grandchildren she barely knew because her own children treated her like a babysitter to be used only in emergencies rather than a beloved grandmother worth including in their lives. Each story carried the same underlying theme of parents who had devoted decades to raising their children, only to discover that good intentions and sacrificial love hadn't automatically translated into lasting respect and affection. These weren't neglectful or abusive parents processing their guilt, but ordinary people who had worked hard to provide for their families and now felt invisible to the children they had prioritized above their own needs and dreams. When Robert's turn came, the words tumbled out with surprising emotion, as if a dam had finally burst after months of holding back his disappointment and confusion. He talked about working double shifts to pay for Linda's college education, about coaching Michael's little league team between factory schedules despite his exhaustion, about always believing that someday he'd have time to really get to know his children as people rather than just dependents requiring constant provision and guidance. "I thought retirement would be when we finally became close," he said, his voice cracking slightly as he spoke to this room of strangers who somehow understood his pain better than his own family. "Instead, I feel like they're strangers who happen to share my last name. They're polite when we interact, but there's no real warmth there, no genuine interest in spending time together or sharing their lives with me." The raw honesty in Robert's voice seemed to resonate with everyone in the circle, heads nodding in recognition of shared experiences that were rarely discussed openly in a society that expected family relationships to be naturally harmonious. Frank listened with the patience of someone who had walked this exact path before, his expression showing understanding rather than judgment, as Robert continued to pour out his frustration and bewilderment. After the formal meeting ended, Frank approached Robert with the unhurried manner of someone who had learned that the most Important conversations couldn't be rushed. "Your story reminds me of my own journey," Frank said simply, his voice carrying the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "I nearly lost my children completely before I learned what I'm about to share with you, but it took me admitting that I was the one who needed to change, not them. That's the hardest truth most parents in our situation have to face." The following. Tuesday, Frank and Robert sat in a corner booth at a local diner, steam rising from their coffee cups as the lunch crowd bustled around them, oblivious to the profound conversation taking place in their midst. The diner's checkered tablecloth and worn vinyl seats provided a comfortable backdrop for what would become one of the most important conversations of Robert's life. Frank began to share his own painful history with the deliberate pace of someone who had told this story before, understanding that rushing through the details would diminish their impact. 20 years ago, my relationship with my 3 kids was not just distant, it was actively toxic, Frank admitted, stirring his coffee. Slowly as he spoke, "I was authoritarian in my approach, demanding respect simply because I was their father and I had sacrificed to provide for them. I criticized their choices constantly, lectured them about gratitude and responsibility, and expected them to prioritize family time regardless of their own commitments and interests. My youngest daughter, Rebecca, stopped speaking to me entirely for 2 years after I criticized her choice of career and husband during what was supposed to be a celebration dinner." Robert shifted uncomfortably in his seat, recognizing uncomfortable parallels in Frank's description that made him question his own recent interactions with Linda and Michael. The authoritarian approach Frank described wasn't exactly how Robert saw himself, but he couldn't deny that his expectations and demands bore disturbing similarities to what Frank was describing. "What changed?" Robert asked, genuinely curious about how someone could bridge such a wide gap after relationships had deteriorated to the point of complete estrangement. "How do you come back from that kind of damage?" "I had to learn that earning respect from adult children requires completely different strategies than raising young children," Frank explained, his eyes growing distant as he recalled his own painful learning process. "The authoritarian approach that might work with a 10-year-old who depends on you for everything will absolutely destroy your relationship with a 30-year-old who has their own life, career, and support system." I discovered 9 specific habits that transformed not just my family relationships, but my entire understanding of what it means to be a father to grown children who no longer need my protection or provision. Frank pulled out a worn notebook from his jacket pocket and opened it to a page filled with his careful handwriting, notes that had obviously been referenced many times over the years. "These aren't theories I read somewhere or advice I heard from a counselor," he said with quiet conviction. "These are practical changes I made in my own life, tested through years of trial and error, refined through countless mistakes and small victories. The first 4 habits deal with the foundation you need to build before anything else can improve. Without this foundation, any other efforts will fail. Habit 1. Accept you can't rewrite the past." Frank's voice grew serious as he began with the first principle, understanding that this foundation would challenge everything Robert believed about defending his parenting choices. "The hardest truth I had to face was that I couldn't defend my way back into my children's hearts. Every time they brought up something I'd done that hurt them during their childhood or adolescence, my immediate instinct was to explain my good intentions or justify my actions based on the circumstances I was facing at the time. I'd tell them about the long hours I worked to provide financial security for them, or how I was just trying to teach them responsibility and prepare them for the real world." Robert nodded emphatically, already feeling defensive about his own parenting choices and the sacrifices he had made for his family's benefit. "But those things are true," he protested with the frustration of someone who felt his efforts were being unfairly dismissed. "I did work those long hours for them, Not for myself. I was trying to be a good provider and teach them important values. Doesn't that count for something? That's exactly what I used to say, Frank replied gently, his tone free of judgment but firm in its conviction. But here's what I learned through painful experience. Your children don't need you to defend your past decisions or explain your historical motivations. They need you to acknowledge the emotional impact those decisions had on them, regardless of your intentions or the external pressures you were facing. There's a crucial difference between explaining your actions and excusing their consequences. Frank shared how his breakthrough moment came when he finally stopped defending and started truly listening to what his children were telling him about their childhood experiences. Instead of explaining why he had missed school events due to work demands, he acknowledged that his absence had made his children feel unimportant and undervalued. Instead of justifying his strict rules and high expectations as character-building exercises, he admitted that his approach had sometimes made them afraid to share their problems with him, creating emotional distance that persisted into their adult years. I wrote each of my children a letter, Frank continued, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had learned these lessons through genuine struggle. Not to ask for forgiveness or to explain my side of the story, but to take full responsibility for the emotional distance I'd created through my choices and priorities. I didn't make excuses about being tired from work or stressed about finances or worried about their futures. I simply acknowledged that I'd prioritized the wrong things during their formative years and that my children had paid an emotional price for my misguided focus on provision over presence. Robert struggled with this concept, feeling like Frank was asking him to shoulder blame that wasn't entirely his to carry, especially when he had genuinely believed he was doing what was best for his family. But what about their responsibility in all this? He asked with the frustration of someone who felt his efforts were being dismissed. Don't they owe me some consideration for everything I sacrificed? Don't they have an obligation to understand the pressure I was under? Frank's expression remained patient but firm, showing the wisdom of someone who had wrestled with these exact same questions. That thinking will keep you stuck exactly where you are right now, he said with gentle honesty. Your children don't owe you gratitude for doing what parents are supposed to do, and demanding recognition for your sacrifices will only push them further away from you. The change has to start with you acknowledging your part in the emotional distance without expecting immediate forgiveness or changed behavior from them in return. Habit 2. Learn their adult language. Moving to the second principle, Frank explained how communication patterns that had worked adequately during childhood often became major obstacles in adult relationships, creating misunderstandings and resentment on both sides. I used to talk to my 40-year-old son the same way I talked to him when he was 15 years old, Frank admitted with obvious regret. Long emotional conversations about how much I missed him and wished we could spend more time together, guilt-laden messages about family being the most important thing in life, and constant invitations to visit that felt more like demands than genuine requests for his company. Robert recognized his own patterns in Frank's description with uncomfortable clarity. His recent conversations with Linda and Michael had been filled with complaints about his loneliness since retirement and subtle guilt trips about their absence from family events and their apparent lack of interest in maintaining regular contact. How do you figure out what language they speak now? He asked, genuinely wanting to understand how to bridge this communication gap. You become a dedicated student of who they've become as adults, Frank explained, with the patience of someone who had learned this lesson through extensive trial and error. My daughter Sarah is a busy emergency room doctor who deals with life and death situations every day. She values efficiency and direct communication because her work environment demands quick, clear decisions. Sending her long emotional emails about missing the old days and wishing we could talk more often just added stress to her already overwhelming schedule and made her see my contact as another burden rather than a blessing. Frank described in detail how he had learned to match each child's communication style rather than forcing them to adapt to his preferences and emotional needs. His introverted son preferred thoughtful, less frequent exchanges that allowed him time to process and respond meaningfully, rather than constant check-ins that felt invasive and demanding. His extroverted daughter enjoyed brief but regular contact that acknowledged her busy schedule while maintaining connection. His middle child, who worked in a high-pressure sales environment, appreciated text messages that were supportive but didn't require immediate responses or lengthy conversations. With your situation, Frank continued, focusing specifically on Robert's challenges, you need to figure out how Linda and Michael communicate most effectively in their professional and personal lives, then adapt your approach to match their preferences rather than expecting them to accommodate your emotional needs and communication style. This insight meant studying Linda's demanding career in marketing and understanding that her phone checking during family dinners wasn't necessarily disrespect or disinterest, but often a reflection of her high-pressure work environment where missing an important communication could have serious professional consequences. It meant recognizing that Michael's preference for email over phone calls wasn't rejection of personal connection, but simply how he processed information most effectively, given his introverted nature and the demands of managing a small farm. Operation. Habit 3. Become a student of their lives. The third habit required a fundamental shift in conversation focus that challenged Robert's natural tendency to center discussions around his own experiences and concerns. I spent years talking primarily about my health problems, my loneliness since retirement, and my disappointment in how rarely we connected as a family, Frank shared with obvious regret. Every conversation somehow became centered on my needs and my feelings and my perspective on their choices. I never asked genuinely thoughtful questions about their challenges or really listened to understand their goals and dreams as independent adults. Frank described his transformation from someone who dominated conversations with his own concerns to someone who genuinely studied his children's current lives with the curiosity and respect he would show to any interesting person he wanted to understand better. Instead of complaining about his isolation and health concerns, he researched his daughter's medical specialty and asked thoughtful questions about her work that demonstrated genuine interest rather than obligation. Instead of criticizing his son's career choices or comparing them unfavorably to more traditional paths, he learned about his industry and the specific challenges he faced, approaching these conversations with curiosity rather than judgment. The key is asking questions without immediately offering solutions or comparing their experiences to your own past, Frank emphasized, understanding that this restraint was particularly difficult for parents who had spent decades in advisory roles. When my son told me about difficulties with a particularly challenging client who was threatening his business relationships, my old response would have been a 20-minute lecture about dealing with difficult people based on my own work experience and management philosophy. My new response was simply asking follow-up questions that helped me understand his unique situation and listening to learn rather than listening to respond with advice. Robert began to see how his conversations with Linda and Michael had been entirely self-focused, even when he thought he was showing interest in their lives. When Linda mentioned work stress or challenging projects, he immediately jumped to advice, based on his factory management experience, never considering that her marketing challenges in a modern corporate environment were completely different from his blue-collar supervisory role in a traditional manufacturing setting. When Michael shared concerns about his small farm operation or sustainable agriculture practices, Robert's response was usually to suggest he return to more stable employment rather than genuinely engaging with his chosen path and learning about his specific goals and challenges. Frank's approach involved developing genuine curiosity about his children's current challenges, professional goals, and personal interests. Treating them as fascinating individuals he wanted to understand, rather than extensions of himself whose choices needed his approval or correction. He subscribed to industry publications related to their careers, not to become an expert or to have ammunition for advice giving, but to ask informed questions that demonstrated respect for their professional expertise. He learned about their hobbies and personal interests enough to engage in meaningful conversations about things that mattered to them, even when those interests differed significantly from his own preferences and values. Habit 4. Create value in their busy lives. The fourth foundational habit involved a complete reversal from making emotional demands to offering practical value that genuinely improved his children's daily experiences. My children are busy adults with their own responsibilities, career pressures, and personal challenges, Frank explained with the clarity of someone who had learned this lesson through painful experience. Calling them to complain about loneliness or demanding more frequent visits just added stress and guilt to their already full lives. But offering genuine help with their real problems created natural opportunities for connection that felt positive rather than burdensome. Frank shared specific, detailed examples of how he had learned to be useful rather than needy in his interactions with his adult children. When his daughter mentioned struggling with home repairs that she couldn't afford to hire professionals to complete, he offered his handyman skills and decades of home maintenance experience without making the help conditional on spending more time together or visiting more frequently. When his son faced challenges with business organization and record-keeping that were threatening his farm's profitability, Frank used his management experience and organizational skills to help streamline operations, focusing entirely on being helpful rather than trying to prove his wisdom or importance. The key is offering help without strings attached, Frank emphasized, understanding that this distinction was crucial for building trust rather than creating additional emotional obligations. I wasn't helping my daughter fix her deck and install new plumbing so she'd visit more often or call more frequently. I was helping because I had skills she needed, and I genuinely wanted to make her life easier and less stressful. The increased connection and improved relationship was a natural result of this approach, not the primary goal or hidden agenda. Robert began to understand how his approach had been completely backward, creating pressure rather than providing relief in his children's lives. Instead of offering practical value based on their actual needs, he had been making emotional demands disguised as offers of help. When Linda mentioned challenges with home organization or house maintenance, his response was usually to suggest she visit more often so he could help, rather than simply offering to come help without expectations or conditions. When Michael faced farming challenges or business decisions, Robert's suggestions usually included implicit or explicit criticism of his career choice, rather than genuine assistance with his actual problems and goals. Frank explained that creating genuine value meant identifying specific skills and resources he could offer without any expectation of emotional return or increased contact. His decades of management experience became genuinely valuable when his children faced workplace challenges, but only when offered as support rather than opportunities to demonstrate his superior wisdom. His practical skills became useful when they needed help with projects, but only when provided without lectures about their life choices or demands for recognition. His emotional stability and life experience became an asset when they needed someone to listen without judgment, but only when he truly listened rather than waiting for opportunities to share his own opinions and advice. The goal isn't to make yourself indispensable or to create dependence, Frank clarified, understanding that some parents might misinterpret this approach. It's to become someone who adds positive value to their lives rather than someone who creates additional emotional burden or stress. When your children begin to associate your presence with help, support, and genuine care rather than demands, expectations, and emotional pressure, everything in the relationship begins to change. As their conversation continued over several hours, Robert began to see how these 4 foundational habits could completely transform his approach to rebuilding relationships with Linda and Michael. The path forward would require him to change his own behavior first, without expecting immediate reciprocation from his children, and to prove through consistent actions that his transformation was genuine rather than manipulative. Subscribe to our channel to continue following Robert's journey and learn the remaining 5 habits that will complete his transformation from a demanding parent to a respected family elder. Over the following weeks, Robert began implementing the first 4 habits Frank had shared with the dedication of someone who finally understood that his current approach wasn't working and needed fundamental change. While progress was slow and sometimes frustrating, he began to notice subtle but meaningful shifts in his interactions with Linda and Michael that gave him hope for the first time in months. His conversations became less centered on his own needs and loneliness and more focused on genuinely understanding their lives as independent adults with their own challenges and goals. But Frank had warned him during their first meeting that the remaining 5 habits would be even more challenging, requiring him to fundamentally change not just his behavior, but his entire perspective on what it meant to be a parent to adult children. These advanced habits would demand that he question assumptions he'd held for decades about family relationships and his role as a father. When they met again the following month at the same corner booth in the diner, Frank could immediately see that Robert had been working diligently on the foundational changes they'd discussed. "You look different," Frank observed with the satisfaction of a mentor seeing genuine progress in a student. "Less frustrated and resentful, more focused and purposeful. That tells me you're ready for the advanced habits that will really transform these relationships and help you become the kind of father your adult children will choose to include in their lives." Frank opened his worn notebook to the next section, his expression growing more serious as he prepared to share lessons that had been particularly difficult for him to learn and implement. These next 5 habits deal with the deeper emotional work of rebuilding respect and genuine connection with adult children who have learned to protect themselves from parental expectations and demands. They're harder because they challenge everything you think you know about being a father and force you to develop new skills that don't come naturally to most parents. Habit 5. Practice patience over pressure. Frank began with what he considered the most difficult habit for most parents to master, especially those who were eager to repair damaged relationships and restore the closeness they remembered from their children's younger years. "My biggest mistake during the early stages of trying to rebuild relationships was trying to rush emotional intimacy," he admitted with obvious regret. "I wanted deep, meaningful conversations immediately. I wanted my children to open up about their lives, share their problems and dreams, and seek my advice the way they had when they were younger and more dependent. When they didn't respond to my efforts as quickly as I hoped, I'd push harder, which only made them pull away more decisively." Robert recognized this pattern immediately and felt embarrassed about his recent behavior. In the weeks since implementing Frank's first 4 habits, he had been disappointed when Linda didn't immediately reciprocate his changed approach with increased warmth and openness. When Michael had actually called him voluntarily for the first time in months, Robert had tried to extend the conversation far beyond what felt natural, sensing Michael's growing discomfort as he pushed for more connection and intimacy than his son was ready to give. Patience means celebrating small improvements without demanding larger ones, Frank explained, with the wisdom of someone who had learned this lesson through painful trial and error. "When my daughter finally called me just to say hello after months of only answering when I called her, I had to resist every instinct to immediately ask when she might visit or whether she'd like to have dinner together. That one voluntary call was progress worth celebrating on its own, without using it as leverage for demanding additional contact or deeper conversation. Frank described in detail how he had learned to be consistently present and supportive without demanding immediate results or keeping score of progress. Instead of tracking who called whom or how often his children reached out, he focused entirely on being reliably available and genuinely supportive whenever they did make contact, regardless of the frequency or depth of those interactions. He shared how this approach had gradually created emotional safety for his children to increase contact at their own pace without feeling pressured or manipulated. "Think of it like tending a garden," Frank said, using a metaphor that had helped him understand this process. You plant seeds with care, water them consistently, provide the right conditions for growth, and trust the natural process of development. You don't dig up the seeds every day to check if they're growing, and you don't try to force faster growth by pulling on the emerging shoots. Rushing the process actually kills the growth you're trying to encourage. Robert struggled with this concept, his impatience fueled by years of distance and his desire for faster progress after finally understanding what needed to change. Frank acknowledged this difficulty, but emphasized that pressure and impatience were the greatest enemies of genuine connection with adult children. Your children have learned over many years to protect themselves from your emotional demands and expectations, he explained. They need sufficient time to trust that your changes are permanent and genuine before they'll risk being vulnerable. With you again, any pressure to accelerate this process will be interpreted as manipulation rather than love. Habit 6. Share your wisdom through stories, not lectures. The sixth habit required Robert to completely transform how he communicated life lessons and offered guidance to his adult children, moving away from the direct advice giving that had characterized his parenting style for decades. "I used to lecture my children constantly," Frank shared with obvious embarrassment about his former approach. "When they faced challenges at work or in their personal lives, I'd immediately jump into advice mode, telling them exactly what they should do based on my experience and the lessons I'd learned throughout my career and life. I thought I was being helpful and sharing valuable wisdom, but they experienced it as patronizing and dismissive of their ability to figure things out themselves." Frank explained how he had learned to embed wisdom and life lessons in personal stories rather than delivering direct advice that could feel condescending to capable adults. When his son faced complicated workplace politics that were affecting his job satisfaction and career prospects, instead of lecturing about respect, professionalism, and office dynamics, Frank shared a detailed story about navigating a particularly difficult supervisor during his own career, describing the strategies he'd used and the lessons he'd learned, while allowing his son to extract whatever wisdom felt relevant to his specific situation. The key is telling stories that relate to their situation without making the connection explicit or spelling out the lesson you want them to learn. Frank continued with the patience of someone who had refined this approach over many years. You share your experience honestly and completely, including your mistakes and uncertainties, and let them decide what, if anything, applies to their circumstances. This approach respects their intelligence and autonomy, while still offering your wisdom and perspective. Robert began to see how his recent attempts to help Linda and Michael had still been lecture-heavy, even when he thought he was being supportive and helpful. When Linda mentioned challenges with a demanding boss who was creating a toxic work environment, his response had been a 20-minute speech about standing up for yourself, demanding respect, and not allowing others to take advantage of your dedication. When Michael shared concerns about sustainable farming practices and the financial challenges of maintaining his principles while staying profitable, Robert had immediately launched into advice about the importance of practical business decisions over idealistic goals. Frank helped Robert practice reframing these interactions as story-sharing opportunities that would feel more like conversations between equals rather than parent-to-child lectures. Instead of telling Linda how to handle workplace conflict, he could share a detailed story about a time he had successfully navigated a similar challenge during his own career, describing his thought process, the actions he'd taken, and what he'd learned from the experience, without explicitly telling her what she should do in her situation. Instead of criticizing Michael's farming choices or offering unsolicited business advice, he could share stories about times when taking calculated risks or standing by his principles had paid off in his own career, allowing Michael to draw his own conclusions about relevance to his situation. "Your children are intelligent, capable adults," Frank reminded him with emphasis. "They don't need you to spell out the lessons or connect the dots for them. They need you to trust their ability to figure out how your experiences might apply to their unique situations." This approach honors their intelligence and independence while still sharing the wisdom you've gained through decades of experience. Habit 7. Respect their independence completely. Frank's expression grew particularly serious as he addressed the 7th habit, which he considered one of the most challenging for parents who had spent decades in advisory and protective roles. "This was perhaps the hardest habit for me to accept and implement consistently," he admitted, with the honesty of someone who had struggled deeply with this concept. "Respecting my children's independence meant supporting their choices even when those choices went against everything I believed was right for them, safe for them, or likely to lead to their long-term happiness and security." He shared his own painful struggle with accepting his daughter's decision to prioritize her demanding medical career over starting a family, despite his deep desire for grandchildren and his belief that she was missing out on one of life's greatest joys. He described his difficulty with his son's choice to live simply on a small organic farm rather than pursuing traditional measures of success like higher income, career advancement, or financial security that Frank believed were important for long-term stability and happiness. "My natural instinct was to voice my concerns, to try to guide them toward what I thought would make them happier, more secure, or more fulfilled," Frank explained, with obvious internal conflict still evident in his voice. "I worried constantly about my daughter's work-life balance and the toll her career was taking on her personal relationships. I was anxious about my son's financial uncertainty and his rejection of conventional career paths that I believed would provide better security for his future." Robert immediately felt defensive and confused by this requirement. "But aren't we supposed to care about their well-being and use our experience to help them avoid mistakes?" he asked with the frustration of someone who felt his parental instincts were being challenged. "Don't our years of experience and life lessons count for something? Shouldn't we at least be able to express our concerns when we see them making choices that might hurt them?" "Of course you care about their well-being," Frank replied gently but firmly, showing the wisdom of someone who had wrestled with these exact same questions and emotions. "But your definition of well-being and success might be fundamentally different from theirs, and your job as the parent of an adult child is to support their right to make their own choices and learn their own lessons, even when you disagree with those choices or fear the consequences they might face." Frank described the ongoing internal struggle of watching his children make decisions he would have made differently while learning to keep his concerns and alternative suggestions to himself unless specifically asked for advice. His daughter's demanding schedule and high-pressure career environment worried him constantly, but he had learned to focus on supporting her in the path she had chosen, rather than trying to convince her to change course toward what he considered a more balanced life. His son's financial uncertainty and rejection of conventional success Measures caused Frank significant anxiety, but he had discovered that his son found deep satisfaction and meaning in sustainable agriculture that traditional career paths had never provided. Respecting their independence doesn't mean you can't have opinions or concerns, Frank clarified, understanding that this distinction was crucial for parents struggling with this concept. It means you keep those opinions to yourself, unless specifically asked for your perspective, and even then, you share them as one viewpoint among many rather than as the definitive answer to their problems or the obviously correct path they should follow. This habit required Robert to examine his recent interactions with Linda and Michael through an entirely new lens, recognizing how many of his comments about Linda's career focus and Michael's farming choices had been subtle or not so subtle, attempts to guide them toward decisions he thought were better for their long-term welfare. Even his offers of help and support had sometimes come with implicit criticism of their choices or suggestions that they reconsider their current paths. Habit 8. Show consistent interest, without expecting returns. The 8th habit dealt with the delicate and crucial balance of maintaining genuine interest in his children's lives without keeping score of their reciprocation or expecting equal investment in return. I used to treat my relationship with my children like a business transaction, Frank admitted with obvious regret about this transactional approach. If I called them twice without getting a call back, I'd stop calling and wait until they reached out to me, which created a standoff that could last for weeks. If I showed detailed interest in their work projects and personal goals, but they didn't ask about my retirement activities or volunteer work, I'd feel resentful and begin to withdraw my support and enthusiasm. Frank explained how this scorecard mentality had actually damaged his relationships further, creating an atmosphere of competition and obligation rather than genuine care and interest. His children could sense his resentment when they didn't reciprocate his efforts in equal measure, which made all interactions feel manipulative and conditional rather than genuinely loving and supportive. Conditional interest isn't really interest at all, he said with the clarity of hard-won wisdom. It's a strategy for getting something back, and your children will recognize it as such. Robert recognized this pattern in his own recent behavior with uncomfortable clarity. When he had started asking Linda about her marketing projects and showing interest in her career challenges, but she hadn't shown equivalent interest in his retirement activities or asked about how he was spending his time, he had felt hurt and unappreciated. This disappointment had led him to respond to her work updates with less enthusiasm and shorter responses. When Michael had appreciated Robert's research into sustainable farming techniques and his practical suggestions, but hadn't reciprocated by asking about Robert's hobbies or personal interests, Robert had felt taken for granted and began to question whether his efforts were worth continuing. Genuine interest has to be unconditional, Frank emphasized, with the conviction of someone who had learned this lesson through painful experience. You send Michael articles about sustainable farming and organic agriculture because you care about his interests and want to support his goals, not because you expect him to thank you or ask about your interests in return. You celebrate Linda's promotions and professional achievements because you want good things for her and take pride in her success, not because you expect her to visit more often or show increased interest in your life. Frank shared how this shift in approach had been surprisingly liberating once he had truly mastered it. Instead of feeling constantly disappointed by his children's responses or lack thereof, he found genuine joy in simply knowing he was adding positive value to their lives and supporting their goals and dreams. When his son finally did start asking about Frank's volunteer work and retirement activities, it felt like a genuine gift rather than something that was owed or expected based on Frank's previous efforts. The paradox is that when you stop expecting returns on your interest and support, you often start receiving them naturally, Frank observed, with the satisfaction of someone who had seen this principle work consistently over time. Your children can sense the difference between genuine care that comes with no strings attached and care that comes with expectations and hidden agendas. Only the genuine version creates the emotional safety they need to reciprocate when they're ready and able to do so. Habit 9. Earn your role as elder, don't assume it. The final habit represented the culmination of everything Frank had learned about rebuilding respect and genuine influence with adult children who had grown up and developed their own support systems and decision-making processes. I spent years demanding respect and deference based solely on my role as their father, he said, with obvious regret about his former approach. I expected them to value my opinions because I was older and more experienced. I assumed they should seek my advice and include me in major decisions because family hierarchy and tradition dictated that parents should be consulted and honored. Frank's voice carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom as he continued to explain this fundamental shift in thinking. But respect isn't automatic just because you're someone's parent, especially if the relationship has been damaged over the years by disappointment, distance, or misunderstanding. You have to earn your role as a respected family elder through consistent demonstration of wisdom, emotional maturity, and genuine value in their adult lives. This transformation meant proving his worth through character and actions, rather than demanding recognition based on his biological relationship or historical role in their upbringing. Instead of expecting his children to seek his advice because he was their father, Frank had focused on becoming someone whose advice was genuinely valuable, relevant, and offered without strings attached, instead of demanding inclusion in their major decisions because of family obligation. He had worked to become someone they wanted to consult because they trusted his judgment and knew he would support whatever decision they ultimately made. It's the difference between being appointed to a position of authority and being elected to it, Frank explained, using an analogy that had helped him understand this transformation. When you're appointed to a role, people follow you or respect you because they have to, because of organizational structure or social expectations. When you're elected to a role, they follow you or respect you because they choose to, because they believe you've earned that position through demonstrated competence and character. Robert began to understand that his recent frustrations stemmed from still expecting respect and influence based on his parental role, rather than earning it through his current actions and character. He had been disappointed when Linda and Michael didn't automatically value his opinions or seek his guidance on important matters, but he hadn't yet proven that his guidance would be helpful, relevant, or offered without judgment or conditions. Frank described how this transformation had culminated in his children voluntarily seeking his input on major life decisions, not because they felt obligated to include their father, but because they had come to genuinely value his perspective, trust his emotional support, and appreciate his ability to listen without judgment or pressure. When my daughter asked me to help her think through a significant career decision last year, it wasn't because she felt she had to involve her father in the process, Frank said with obvious pride and satisfaction. It was because she trusted. My judgment knew I would support whatever decision she made and valued my ability to ask thoughtful questions that helped her clarify her own thinking. The conversation had stretched over several hours, and Robert felt both overwhelmed by the scope of change required and hopeful about the possibility of transformation that Frank's story represented. The 9 habits represented a complete overhaul of how he had been approaching his relationships with Linda and Michael. But Frank's successful transformation gave him concrete hope that change was possible even after decades of distance and misunderstanding. These habits work, Frank said as they prepared to leave the diner, but only if you're willing to change yourself first, without expecting immediate reciprocation from your children. The transformation has to be genuine and permanent, not a strategy for getting what you want from them. If you're finding these insights helpful for your own family relationships, please like this video to help others discover these life-changing principles. 6 months after that first conversation with Frank in the community center support group, Robert's transformation had created changes he could never have imagined when he first walked into that circle of folding chairs. The breakthrough came gradually through consistent application of the 9 habits rather than any single dramatic moment or grand gesture. He had learned to write letters, taking full responsibility for his emotional absence during Linda and Michael's childhood, without making excuses about working long hours or the financial pressures he had faced. Those letters hadn't immediately changed everything, but they had opened doors to honest conversations that had been closed for years. Robert had also completely revolutionized how he communicated with his children, moving away from the emotional demands and guilt-laden messages that had characterized their interactions for so long. Instead of sending Linda long emotional messages about missing her and wishing they could spend more time together, he started sending brief, supportive texts about her work challenges that showed genuine interest without creating pressure. When Michael mentioned difficulties with his organic farming operation, Robert offered his organizational experience to help streamline operations rather than suggesting he find more stable employment or questioning his career choices. These practical offers of help, given without strings attached or hidden agendas, had created natural opportunities for connection that felt valuable rather than burdensome. The real test of Robert's transformation came when both children began making major life decisions that would have previously triggered his anxiety and unwanted advice. Linda announced her engagement to a man Robert had met only twice, and instead of feeling hurt about being excluded from their courtship or expressing concerns about her choice, he focused entirely on celebrating her happiness and offering genuine support for her decision. When she asked him to help plan the wedding, it wasn't because she felt obligated to include her father in the process, but because she genuinely wanted his involvement and had come to trust his judgment and emotional stability. Michael's decision to expand his farm with a significant financial investment had worried Robert deeply. But instead of lecturing about security and practical concerns, he had shared stories about calculated risks he had taken in his own career, allowing Michael to extract whatever wisdom felt relevant without feeling pressured or judged. The moment that truly crystallized Robert's success came when Michael called specifically to invite him to spend a week at the farm. This wasn't a brief holiday visit filled with awkward conversations and uncomfortable silences, but a genuine invitation because Michael was excited to show off improvements they had discussed and to get Robert's input on future plans and challenges. Linda's wedding planning sessions had become opportunities for real connection, with conversations flowing naturally between practical details and deeper discussions about relationships, life goals, and dreams for the future. Both children had begun seeking his perspective on important decisions, not because they felt obligated to consult their father, but because they had come to value his wisdom and trust his support. Perhaps the most profound change was in how Robert felt about himself as a father and as a person. Instead of the constant frustration and resentment that had characterized his early retirement, he experienced genuine pride in the adults his children had become and satisfaction in the relationships they were building together. He had stopped trying to reshape them according to his vision of success and had learned to appreciate the unique paths they had chosen, even when those paths differed significantly from what he would have selected for them. This shift from demanding respect based on his role to earning it through consistent value and character had transformed him from someone his children endured to someone they actively sought out for wisdom and support. Robert's story illustrates a crucial truth about relationships with adult children that many parents struggle to accept. The power to change these connections lies entirely in your hands. You cannot control whether your children immediately reciprocate your efforts or how quickly they respond to your changed approach. But you can control whether you take responsibility for your part in any distance that exists, whether you adapt your communication to their adult needs and preferences, and whether you offer genuine value rather than emotional demands and expectations. The 9 habits Robert learned through Frank's mentorship aren't theoretical concepts, but practical changes you can begin implementing in your own family relationships today. You can start accepting that you cannot rewrite the past while taking full responsibility for your emotional choices and their impact on your children. You can learn your children's adult communication styles and become a genuine student of their current lives, interests, and challenges. You can offer practical value instead of making emotional demands, practice patience over pressure, and share wisdom through stories rather than lectures that feel patronizing to capable adults. Most importantly, you can begin earning your role as a respected family elder, rather than assuming that role is automatically yours based on biology or history. The question now is how you're going to apply these lessons to your own family relationships. Which of the 9 habits resonates most strongly with your current situation? What patterns in your interactions with your adult children need to change first? Are you ready to take responsibility for your part in any distance that exists without expecting immediate changes from them in return? How will you begin demonstrating through consistent actions that you value them as the adults they've become rather than trying to recreate the children they once were? Your relationships with your adult children don't have to remain strained, superficial, or disappointing. The respect and genuine connection you long for are absolutely achievable, but they require you to change your approach fundamentally and commit to consistent growth even when progress feels slow or uncertain. If this story has inspired you to begin rebuilding your own family relationships with dignity, wisdom, and genuine respect for your children's independence, please like this video and subscribe to our channel for more guidance on navigating life's most important challenges.